We're going to start with our third attribute of God, omnipresence. And basically what this is that God is present everywhere at the same time. As always, though, we will start with a little Bible study and go through some of the verses that indicate God being omnipresent. So I'm going to start in Psalms 139. Again, I'll just read the verses and then sort of explain them a little bit. So Psalm 139, verses 7 through 12. It says, "Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night, even the darkness is not dark to you, and the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike to you." So again, this is just an expression of God's omnipresence. God is everywhere. The writer of the psalm here is like saying that he can't get away from God no matter where he goes. Sheol is even considered hell or the underworld, that even there he can't escape God's presence. And then we will go to Jeremiah chapter 23, verses 23 and 24. "I am a God who is near, declares the Lord, and not a God far off. Can a man hide himself in the hiding places, so I do not see him, declares the Lord? Do I not fill the heavens and the earth, declares the Lord?" And here God is saying that he is not like a local God. The other gods at the time in Israel were localized. They were, they had idols, they had statues, and they actually believed that that's where their God dwelled. God is saying that he's not just a local God, like he is everywhere. In 1 Kings, chapters 8, verse 27, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you, much less this house which I have built." Here is Solomon is dedicating the temple. Solomon had just built the great temple, and he's dedicating it to God. But then he's also saying that like even this temple cannot contain God, and this is something I think is key, that God doesn't dwell inside a building. Like God doesn't need the church building. God doesn't need like a temple. That God isn't contained within a church. God is everywhere. And then I want to just go to the New Testament, as I like to do, reiterating the same thing. In Acts 17, verse 24, "The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands." And this is Paul actually on his sermon on Mars Hill is talking about this. And it's interesting, when he was giving this sermon, the temple of Athena was behind him in Athens. And again, he is pointing out that, the God of Jehovah doesn't need this temple like Athena did. Athena, they said, dwelled in the temple. So those are the sort of biblical data on God being everywhere. If anybody wants to say anything about that or add to it. If not, I'm just going to move on and we'll start our discussion of it. I first want to go through two sort of common errors in the way people think about this, or maybe the way you were traditionally raised in a Christian household. And the first is that Solomon had said, that God isn't localized. Like he doesn't just go to specific spots. He's not in this church, and then when you leave the church, God's no longer there. Or, God's not in the nicer big churches that look like churches, but he sort of ignores the other churches. God's everywhere. Churches are sort of set apart, but by us. Like we make them sacred places for God. God doesn't need the church to come and be his presence. His presence is everywhere. And so this is what we sort of mean by God being omnipresent. He is in every part of the world all the time, equally. The other sort of error people think, that not only is God not localized to a church, he's not localized to heaven. Like God isn't sitting up in heaven. It's not like up on a throne, just up in heaven, just sort of watching. Maybe he's got this ball that he looks at everybody and it's just watching what everybody does. God is not in heaven. He's not up there. So again, I think there are a lot of people who sort of think this, that may be raised in a sort of religious background, that think that, God's up in heaven on a throne, and like we're down here, and he sort of just watches us. So I'm going to pose a question like, how does God then relate to space and like reality? How does God relate to the world? You don't have to answer. There's two ways. Like, does he exist everywhere in space? Like, yeah, I said in time, like he exists throughout all time. Or does he like transcend space? Is he just sort of outside of space altogether? Not outside because that's a spatial relation, but God transcends space. Again, remember how I talked about time, that God could either be sort of outside of time or just be throughout all of time. And this is sort of that same question. Does he exist? Does he actually exist everywhere in space, or does he transcend space? Now, in the Bible, they sort of hint that God is everywhere in space, but I think this is more a narrative device, or the way they sort of write. Like I said, the Bible isn't like a philosophy book. The traditional view, and sort of my view, is that God transcends space. And the reason being is that God is spirit. God's incorporeal. He doesn't have a body. He doesn't have a form. He doesn't have, like, again, when you say spirit, though, avoid thinking of a spirit as, like, sometimes we think in modern culture, like a ghost. Like, God doesn't have a form. Like, he's formless. He doesn't have, like, this sort of ether he's made out of, or, like, this ectoplasm or whatever ghosts are made out of. So it's not like he's filling the whole universe with this present stuff, and that like when the universe expands, is God expanding with it. Like the universe is not filled with God's body. God does not have a body. Like he is spaceless, he is formless. So when we say that God is omnipresent, it's not that he is present in the way that we think. It's not that he's present in a form or like a body. So what we want to say is, and what I think the good technical definition of God being omnipresent is that, I'll read it twice, that God is causally active and fully cognizant or fully aware of every part of reality at every moment. So that's what I think God's omnipresence is. Let me read it again. God is causally active and fully cognizant of every part of reality at all times. So again, we tend to think of presence as sort of a physical attribute or a material thing, but God is not present in that way. Like God is not like a form or a being that's just here with us. Like we're not inside of God in that way, but he is here with us. So what this sort of means for us, and it's sort of very comforting to me, is that God is always within contact. God is always there. Everywhere you go, no matter where you are, like God, even Christ there is with us. And so even in times of pain or trial, or like when you're down in the dumps, or work is getting you down, that like God's always there. God is, like I said, omnipresent. So that's actually, I think, a very sort of simple trait of God to understand, but does anybody have any questions about it? Take the microphone.
Hello. You said that God is not like sitting on a throne in heaven, but like can God take form and sit on the throne in heaven and also be causally active and fully cognizant of all reality at all times? Like can he also be on the throne while he's...
I mean, I don't think so. Like what form would he take? I mean...
But the Bible does talk about like him sitting on the throne.
Yes, but again, I think there's much of the Bible that is doing an analogy. It's describing God in a certain way. Like the Bible anthropomorphizes God. Is God riding around on a cloud?
Right. I get, yeah, that's true. It does anthropomorphize, but like Isaiah says that like in his vision, where it almost seems like God actually pulled him into heaven. he doesn't even have words to describe it, but it seems like he actually does see God and the seraphims like flying around God. Or you think that's just simply a vision?
I think it's a vision.
Okay.
And because it also says man can't comprehend God. I think God can, God represents himself like with Moses with the burning bush.
Right.
Like God, but God's not a burning bush. Or when God speaks, like God doesn't have a voice, but I think God could speak in a way that could be heard because he could change the sound waves in the air, or he could move the air.
It's just like a weird concept, because I kind of like, when I speak to God, I kind of like I like to like see him.
Do you visualize something?
Yeah. So it's just like a weird concept, I think.
It is.
For me, it's hard to I don't know.
How would you explain the whole idea then that Paul talks about of a spiritual body? And I would relate to that, God saying, we'll make man in our image.
In terms of like making man in God's image, I think that a lot of that is, I described this before, more in the way, when God says like I am that I am, I think much of like that is in us. Like we have this sort of consciousness that is from God.
Or like nature, like image, like as in his nature, or like.
Yes, the moral law that is on our hearts is like in God's image. The fact that we are like creative in a way that like is like God. The fact that we have like a soul. Again, when you think of your soul, you don't think of your soul as having any form. Like your soul is sort of in your body, but it's not like in your body. Like we are like spirit body composites, where again God is not a spirit body composite. But his spirit, I think, is different than what our spirit would be, in that his spirit is everywhere.
So this scripture in Acts 17 where Paul said he doesn't dwell in temples made with hands, it's kind of like comes in direct contrast with the whole study of when they made the temple. In the old days, they made the temple and they had like an outer room, an inner room, and then the Holy of Holies. And you had to like cleanse yourself before you went in the Holy Holies. And it always kind of gave me this sense that God was more concentrated in certain areas than in other areas. And it sounds like it's all just a big analogy, and it's not true at all. Or what? I don't really
When I say that God is causally active and fully cognizant, it's not that he is equally. God is not as fully active on Jupiter as he is on Earth, but like he is still present like on Jupiter. So again, I think that when you think of like the Holy of Holies, or in church when God we say like, oh, God's presence, I think it's like maybe he is being more active, but it doesn't mean he is like less present somewhere else. Okay. But it's just that he's more focused in certain areas.
More concentrated.
Again, like you get to analogies when you start talking, because it's the only way to sort of conceive of this thing. But also, like after Christ, it said that we didn't need a holy temple anymore.
So, Ben, are you saying that God I know you're saying he's formless, and yet aspects of his personality and aspects of his having something of sight, like God's eyes are on the sparrow, or his hand moves. So I'm assuming when I read the Bible that in some ways, even though it might not be something I can wrap my head around, I've always gotten the impression that he in some way has form, that we're made in his image, and eyes and heart, and hands, and feet, because the Bible just refers to those things so many times in a description of God. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that that's all poetic or all,
I don't necessarily think like poetic, because mm-hmm. We make sort of analogies all the time, and we mm-hmm. use them, even like scientists and mathematicians do. It's not that it's just poetic. It's just like sort of, it's a way to grasp the way like God works, or the mm-hmm. way God moves, or mm-hmm. the way, like even to say like God moves. But again, like when you sort of think about if God has some sort of body, how then is he everywhere? Mm-hmm. And that's sort of where, again, I'm not talking about Christ and Christ's resurrected body. I'm just talking about sort of the Godhead and God having this quality. And again, don't think of it in a physical way, like God being everywhere. When I say like he is it talks about how he sustains the creation, and that's what I mean by being causally active. Like, creation is sustained through him, and he's also fully aware of everything. You hear that saying, like, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it really make a sound? Well, God knows that it makes a sound. That's sort of because he's cognizant of everything that happens.
Ben, we know that the Lord can do all things and take on form even. When he walked in front of Moses and he said to Moses, "You cannot see me, except as I pass, I will let you see, my back as I walk past." Now, yeah, he took on form at that point. So again, I believe the Lord can do, obviously, far beyond we can ask or think.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, like the same way that's why I brought up the burning bush.
right.
And then the burning bush became a sacred, like they said, a sacred place. Like he can take on forms. And then there's stuff where it's like, we talk about hearing God's voice, like we don't hear it, but then there are moments, I think, where God does have a voice.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But again, it's not like God's voice. I think he's just creating a voice for people to hear,
The scripture says we will see him face to face. Now, obviously, we'll be in spirit. He's in spirit.
And again, I think a lot of this can be like face to face could just mean without the barriers of our flesh, like we're actually in God's real presence without sort of the hindrance of flesh. I think it's just like I like to, again, and this might be objectionable to some people, but there are people who are incredibly literal with the Bible and a lot of this stuff, and I think you can get, and again, a lot of sort of the traditional Mormon views were like that God is like a person up in space, and if you start to take some of this stuff too literal, like you can sort of, it creates contradictions. Like I said, the contradiction of God having a body and being up in heaven, sitting on a throne, well then how is he everywhere? Because the Bible talks about him being everywhere. There's nowhere God is not. So I think we have to give some leeway to the writers and their narrative and the way they're sort of using analogy, but it's not to say that they're wrong or they're creating a contradiction.
The Bible, what just made me think, I just thought of this, that helps me understand it better, is the Bible does say that God is light. And part of light is radio waves, gamma rays, X-rays, radiation, that penetrates everything. We only see this little tiny part of the light spectrum. So God is if he's light, he is everywhere. And he can concentrate himself anywhere he wants.
Yeah, and it's just, like I was talking about time, and we only have this perception of time, where when I drew on the thing, where it's not just like, here's time and here's God, I think it's everything. It's like the way God sort of allows us to experience him, I think is only a tiny small part of what God actually is. So again, when he does take on certain forms, I think it's for our benefit, but it's not to be made to think that, oh, that's what God is. That's what God is right there. I wanted to make another point about, I thought of like going back to how when God says, or when the Bible says that God isn't in a building, or he's not like beholden to a temple, he's not in a church. I think this is really important, especially today, is that so much of the violence in the world is because certain belief systems and even Christians hold on to certain locations as being sacred or holy, or like this is where God is, and then it causes so much bloodshed and so much violence. And again, like I said, like when Christ came, like there was no more need for a holy of holies. There was no need for a temple. So yes, it's lovely to have a building, it's lovely to have a church, but it's like wherever you go, like the church is with you. God is not in this building exclusively. Any more questions about omnipresence? Like I said, I think this one is a lot simpler than eternity. All right, when this is going good, we might get actually through 2 attributes. All right, so next we're going to go to God's immutability. And what this means is God's unchangeability. I've talked about some of this before, but I'll go back through it again as we come to it. But first, again, I want to go to our Bible verses. I should actually just make people read Bible verses. We're going to start in Psalm chapter 102, verses 25 and 27. Of old you founded the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. Even they will perish, but you endure. And all of them will wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them, and they will change. But you are the same, and your years will not come to an end. So this is just saying that God in his being, in his existence, is unchangeable. That he doesn't go into being, and he doesn't come out of being. Because again, I talked about this in God's aseity. Like God wasn't created, and he will not perish. Then we will go to Malachi chapter 3, verse 6. For I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. And also in that same vein, I want to go to James 1:17, because both these verses are sort of related. So James chapter 1, verse 17. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. So what both these verses are saying is that God is unchanging in like his character and how he deals with us. Like he doesn't get in a bad mood and then suddenly like wipe out Israel. That's what he says, that Israel will not be consumed. God says because he's not changing. He's not going to then consume them because they make him angry. And then also here it's again like he doesn't change with us like based on moods like we would. You know, he doesn't come down and he's not like a shadow. So again, this is relating to God's character. So the first Psalms was talking about God and his being. This is God and his character. So then Psalm 119, I want to go to a lot of Psalms are great. You should read them all the time. 89 and 90. Forever, O Lord, your word is settled in heaven. Your faithfulness continues throughout all generations. You establish the earth and it stands. So this is talking about God's faithfulness is unchanging. That it continues through all generations. Then again, this is also reiterated in Hebrews chapter 6, 17 and 18. In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise... In the same way, God, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, interposed with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have taken refuge would have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us. So again, they use the word unchangeable twice. That in his promises and in his oath, that God is faithful. He doesn't change. It's not like us. It's like, hey, ask me to help you move, and I'm like, promise I'll be there. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to be there because I don't want to help somebody move. God doesn't do that. God doesn't like make a promise because like he doesn't want to tell you no because it would make him look bad. And then one final verse. We will go to Psalms 33, verse 11. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart from generation to generation. Is that the right verse? Yes. And this is the counsel. God's counsel is God's wisdom. Like God's wisdom doesn't change. He doesn't like come up with a plan and then like halfway through the plan be like, oh man, this plan actually isn't working out so well. Let me do a different plan. You know, he's not like us. He doesn't make bad plans. He doesn't decide something and then change his mind. And yes, I know the Bible talks about God changing his mind. But he doesn't like then think it's a bad idea and then say like, oh, that plan was oh, you know what, that covenant I made with Israel, I don't like it anymore. I'm just going to get rid of it. Or God's promise of salvation to us, it's not like he's going to change it. All right, so this is what's called God's immutability, God's unchangeability. I want to go into sort of some of the history of this, is that a lot of some of the Christian foundational beliefs are very rooted in Greek thought and Greek philosophy. And a lot of that I think is good. I think that's sort of like Western thinking comes from a lot of that. But in this respect, the older church sort of took on a quality of this that Aristotle put forth that I sort of disagree with. Aristotle called God like the unmoved mover. And sort of the traditional belief is that God is absolutely immutable. Like he is essentially immutable. Like he doesn't change at all. And I disagree with this. God would be like a statue, like he's like a sort of changeless statue. You just have to read the Bible. God is like sort of a living God. He's a dynamic God. But what they'll do, how they'll do this is they'll say God is perfect, and any change would have to be a change for the worst, because when you're perfect, you can't get better. However, this is sort of like just looking at just a vertical scale. I'm going to draw this out. So you have like a scale here, and you have like best and the worst, and then you have like perfection up here, and then this line would represent change. So God is already at the best, so any change would then therefore make him worst, and that's not possible because he's perfect. So this is the way they viewed it. But I think there is a horizontal aspect to the scale that they totally disregard. And this is what I talked about in intrinsic versus extrinsic change, that an intrinsic change is something that happens in something essentially. I talked about Josiah with Abby, that when Abby was younger, she was shorter than Josiah. But now that Abby is older, she's taller than Josiah. And what happened was Abby went through an intrinsic change, but Josiah went through an extrinsic change of being at one point taller than Abby and now shorter than Abby. So Josiah changed.
Not yet.
Soon. But then again, like I said, this isn't really the only way I think that God is changeless, but these are relational changes. But again, I talked about God in time and how God sort of responds to things in time, and he changes in his, I brought up the question of does God know what time it is right now? Well, we believe that God knows all facts, so he would know what time it is right now. But then if we say that 5 minutes later, it's going to be a different answer. So God sort of changes in his knowledge of the time. So there's certain ways in which God is unchangeable, but I don't think he is completely unchangeable in everything. So that's sort of what I think about God being immutable. So I'm going to go through. Well, first let me open it up, not sort of asking questions about immutability, but does anybody want to sort of comment? Because I have 6 ways I think that God is unchangeable, and I'm going to go through those. And then if you want, we'll talk about those, or if you want to change them. Question back there first. Bless you.
Not a question, more an observation, Ben, because I've been reading Jeremiah, and it's interesting. You'll read that the Lord gets angry with Israel, and he threatens that he will abolish them to Egypt or send them away. And sometimes he shows so much patience, and eventually he does send them away or punish them. But then you see his heart. He always relents, or he brings them back. His mercy extends beyond, so it's not that he's changing, but you just see almost the anger of God, his reaction, and yet his mercy is steadfast.
It's also Israel changed.
Right. Well, from disobedience. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're probably going to get to that later, when God said that he grieved that he made man. He doesn't. That's just really the man's way of putting it. He just kind of changed his man.
You're getting on to what I think.
Okay, I'll wait.
All right, so these are the ways that I think that God does not change. Number 1, God's life doesn't change. And this goes to the first. God's existence does not change. He has existed forever, and he had no beginning, he has no end. God does not mature, and he does not regress. He didn't start as a premature God and become a mature God. He is permanent, as we said. The first attribute, God's aseity. He is permanent and he is eternal. He never begins and he never ends. Number two, God's character doesn't change. So we talk about God being merciful, God being just, God being loving, God being faithful, God being kind, etc., etc. Like those things don't change. He doesn't love us more one day and then love us love us less the next day. And then also part of character is his moral perfection doesn't change. Like his attributes don't change. He doesn't think one thing. He doesn't say, oh, this is wrong, and then a while later say, oh, it's not wrong anymore. Number three, God's truth doesn't change. And in the Bible it says the word of the Lord endures forever. That God is trustworthy. As I said, ask me to move, don't trust me. God is trustworthy. God's not a liar. God's ways do not change. Number four. Ways maybe was not the right word to use there, but basically what I want to say is that God is consistent with the other thing. Like he's consistent, but yet his methods change. In terms of, you can think of like the old covenant versus the new covenant. Like people used to have to make sacrifices, but now they don't. But so the methods change, but like the essential way doesn't change. Like how God views sin and grace and forgiveness and the law is the same, just because he deals with different people differently because we're different. Number five, God's purposes do not change. God makes plans, they don't change. Like he doesn't get caught by surprise. Like God's not shocked by something. God makes a plan, and it's not like, oh, I didn't think that would happen when I decided to create the universe. It's not like we were universe number 35 because the first 34 are all screwed up, because we're pretty screwed up. And then number six, also, Jesus Christ does not change in these ways. Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So I just wanted to throw that in there because all these things that were said about God are also said about Christ. Okay, now let's open it up to discussion. I can write them down. Yeah. I'm writing down. So, in his existence, he does not change. In his character, he does not change. His truth, in his ways, his purposes, or his plans, and then Christ does not change in these ways. All right. Yeah.
When I read the Bible, I actually feel like he does sort of change his mind sometimes. And I kind of view it as like, well, I can think of a few just off the top of my head when he does like the flood and he says, I'm sorry that I ever made man. I kind of, in my heart, took that as like he has emotions, and like that's one of the ways that we are made like him, so he feels things. So even though his plan, like he might have known this is what's going to happen and this is what I'm going to do, and he knew the whole plan, he still feels, he can feel something one day and feel something else the next day based on what's happening. But it sounds like you're saying that's not the case.
Well, this is the sort of thing where, I mean, because this is the first class you've come to, I said, like, when I started this, like, a lot of these things I don't think are, like, so God is unchanging. Now, the thing that's up for discussion is like, what does that mean? And God changes, and like, these are doctrines, but, like, I sort of said that there's essential doctrines, and then there's things that aren't essential. So, like, you can take different stances, and I don't think that really makes you a non-Christian. If, like, and I think sort of what you're describing could be one of them. I argue for my personal view because I'm up here with the mic I think this is what I think. I think that a lot of... So we didn't get into God's omniscience or God's being all-knowing. But part of that would be that God has foreknowledge of everything. So when it's written like stuff like that, like part of me, like I'd never heard that before, like that way, but part of me thinks that it's more the men who wrote the Bible, God gave them sort of freedom of expression, and God still knew that he was going to get said what he wanted said. So I think a lot of it is they're perceiving it, you know, like when Hezekiah thinks that God changed his mind, or when Jonah, and he says God's going to like get rid of Nineveh in 40 days if you don't go, but then it says like God changed his mind. I think it could be more the writer perceives it that way than God. I don't think God like actually changed his mind because he knew what was going to happen. But
what didn't change with Jonah and him is the fact that his character has always demonstrated mercy over judgment.
yes,
So when they repented, his character remained the same.
I mean, because the thing is, it's like that. This is because we have to sort of answer what seems like the contradiction in the Bible. Like we have to come up with an answer. So that's your way of answering it. Sort of my way of answering it. You know, because God changed sort of, like Dave said, his mind. It didn't change sort of his essential character. And it could be, like in some ways, like maybe sort of stuff we do does cause those things to change, but God knows it's already going to happen, even though it's, again, when we get into God's knowledge, this stuff, that's a more complex thing, but, you know, it could be that if Jonah didn't go, then yes, Nineveh would get destroyed, but because he did go, God didn't destroy Nineveh. But again, there isn't, like I said, necessarily a right or wrong answer, I don't believe, when it talks about God like changing his mind. And again, I want it to be clear, when I say God is unchangeable, he's not completely unchangeable. You know, I think he's unchangeable in these things. Like God's nature is unchangeable. I'm surprised nobody answered the big question yet.
This might be a little bit of a step back, but with the omnipresence and knowing everything, how do you then justify the fact that one of man's perceived greatest gifts is free will, if he already knows everything that's happening? So is it really free will, or is it all predetermined?
All right, so I will give you a short answer, but I'm going to have to tell you to come back to the class, because when we get to God's knowledge, I'm going to answer that question. But, all right, so for example, though, I'll use an analogy to answer you. So, you can say, like, we're getting okay at predicting the weather, and you can imagine in the future that technology might get to a certain point where we can perfectly know and predict the weather. Might create this super barometer that can tell us exactly what the weather is going to be on a specific day. Does that then mean that we cause the weather? I mean, that's sort of my response to that. But again, it is like it's a very, very, very big question, and I have a very, very thorough answer that is going to take like a whole hour. So I'll tell you when that class is happening.
Yeah, make sure Doug knows that.
Because because I don't want to just dismiss you like that, there's different types of knowledge that we're talking about, like God knows, like, does God just know true facts? Does he know, like, every choice we're going to make? There's this thing called middle knowledge it's just sort of that God knows what's going to happen based on different decisions we make. So God knows if we made this decision, this would happen. If we made this decision, this would happen. But he's then not sort of causing us to make those decisions. So
we do know that God changes in the sense that he did become fully man.
Here's the question I was...
Oh, okay. So he was born as a an actual baby, an infant, and then physically grew, like you had said before, like God wasn't like an immature God and became a mature God, yet he actually was an infant and became a mature man before he died. So he did change, right? Like as when he was fully man, he changed.
Mm-hmm.
So does that conflict? I mean, I don't think it does, but I'm wondering, like, can you make the case
How do
that-
you answer that question, basically?
Yeah, like, does that conflict with the idea that God can't change or doesn't change?
Well, again, remember I said that God, it's not that God can't change. I just said he's unchanging in these certain respects. So again, this is the question that's brought up by the incarnation, like that God becoming man in Jesus Christ. Now, the thing to remember, though, that the way we understand this and the way that Paul talks about it is that Christ was both man and God fully. He was fully God and fully man. He didn't become this man-God hybrid. Like he didn't become like, in Hinduism they have what's called avatars, where they become this man-God hybrid. You can think of like in Greek times, like Hercules becomes like a demigod. He's like half God, half man. In Christianity, we don't have that. We don't believe that. It's actually called the hypostatic union. That God was both fully God. I mean, Christ was both fully God and fully man, so that he retained like his divine nature. So his divine nature never changed. Like these things never changed. But then he took on a human nature, and that human nature changed. That human nature aged. That human nature died. The human nature suffered, was tempted. But it's
Hypostatic union is really would be the way to respond to that.
Yes. And you've heard that before, I guess?
I've actually never heard
Oh, okay.
that. I'm actually really glad I asked that, 'cause I've never heard of the hypostatic union.
So again, like his divine nature never changed, but his human nature did change. And again, there you can get into, again, and Paul says in Colossians, like in him all the fullness and all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form. So again, that's sort of the way like we understand that, is that God's nature in Christ didn't change. There was no, like I said, no merging of the two. He was both man and both God. We can get in discussions of like, did he have all of the qualities of God while he was in human form? I don't think so. God, because you even talk about God's existence, like God can't die, but like the human nature of Christ died, but then rose from the dead.
This question may be getting a little off topic, but at what age do you think Jesus in the flesh became aware that he was Almighty God?
Oh, I've wondered that before too.
You think when at the temple?
By the way, you're God at like age of 7. Well, like, did you know that?
I mean there's no like answer to that. It's more just like my opinion.
I mean, the Bible says that at the age of 12, he said, I want to go about my father's business. So
Yeah.
we know by 12 years old, he did know.
Well, do we know that he knew?
He wanted to be a carpenter. No, I mean, and I think in having the one thing you did say, did God like tell him? I don't think no. I think because he had that divine nature, like he was God. So at a certain point, he just knew.
I wonder if he actually had to figure it out.
You can ask him one day. I mean, it's an interesting thing to think, and that's what this class is for. Like, talk about stuff we've thought about, but always been afraid to ask. But yeah, again, some things I didn't touch at. Well, does anybody else want to sort of talk about God's immutability, God's unchanging? Again, like you got to be careful. Like, even me when I started studying this, I think I sort of had this idea in my head years ago that like God is changeless, like he doesn't change at all. But again, once you start studying it, it's like that's sort of impossible. Like it's impossible for God not to have relation changes with us, because again, we go from the state of not knowing God to knowing God if you were like not a Christian. So again, God changes in that way. It's just that God's essential divine nature like does not change. And that's why we can trust in him. That's why we can trust in God. as I sort of brought up like Hinduism a little bit, like as they said, they sort of believe in these avatars where like sort of God and man will mix. In terms of like Islam and these attributes, there's a majority of Muslim scholars would say that God is not omnipresent. There is up for debate, but they do think that God is not everywhere. Some of them think that that's like blasphemous. They think that God is sort of up in heaven, but he sort of, like I described, sees the earth and knows everything that's going on all the time. But they don't think that he is everywhere. But again, that's not 100%. That's not like a strict Muslim doctrine. Some of the more liberal Muslim scholars are open to him being omnipresent. They do think that he is unchangeable, even more so than Christians do, that he is very, very unchanging. Again, Allah is described in sort of his attributes. There's like the 99 names for Allah, and those are all just his attributes, and they say all 99 of those like are unchanging.
And the reason for the microphone is because it's being recorded?
Yes.
When the Bible refers to heaven then, or him sitting on his throne, or, when he comes down from heaven,
Put it in one hand and move the other.
where is heaven? So when you say there's not a up there, what do you think?
Well, there's a heaven,
Okay.
because there's like they talks about heaven. There's where the angels dwell, and
Yeah, okay, so there is a heaven.
yes, where is it?
Yeah,
I don't know.
we just don't know.
Yeah, maybe it's on the dark side of the moon. But again, I think that we are so like limited in our perception of like reality that I'll draw that picture again. Like you can imagine, here is like our universe, or what we understand to be the universe. And like this is everything we know, all space and time, everything that we can perceive, everything we know. But I think and I had said like God, I put God up here, but I don't think they're separate. I think that this is just, there's everything that we are not aware of because we are so limited in our functioning. And so that heaven could essentially be right here. We're not aware. I mean, you can think of it, again, these are analogies. You can think of it in terms of dimensions. Like, we're aware of 4 dimensions, but you could say like maybe there's 60 dimensions and we're just not aware of them. It's not, I don't know, it's not, actually that's not something I think about. I've thought about that much. So sorry I don't have a more.
Art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. So Jesus referred to God as being somewhere, even not just with us, but somewhere.
Again, and I think it's not like he's trying to trick us or he's like lying. It's just a manner of speaking, like a mannerism. Because he's true, God is in heaven fully, but he's also here, It's to say that, maybe God up in heaven, there is no, the angels fully perceive God where we don't. So, maybe where I said that like God isn't sort of omnipresent equally. So maybe up in heaven he's more causally active and more there than he is here. Did you have something to say?
I always have something. When God was given the prophets thousands and thousands of years ago, vision of things that would take place today, there's things that weren't in their lives. So what were they seeing? Were they seeing television sets? So were they saying that the lights were glowing? I mean, that's all they can say. So God speaks to us in a very limited way because we see in such a small way that he can't really tell us what it really is. So the Bible is full of language that it's extremely limited because we wouldn't understand.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of my view. Like I said, the Bible it's not a science book, it's not a philosophy book, it's God's story to us. So much of it is written in that way for us to understand it. And like I said, I don't think there's things I think if these things were like important, like the Bible would be more clear. Like the Bible is very clear on what's important. That's why Christ's life has 4 books, It's like these things I don't, like I said, they're interesting to talk about.
But they don't make your salvation.
Yeah, and it's like not good to get hung up on them. I said it in my very first class, I said there's people that get hung up on particular doctrines that don't matter, and then it can cause them to sort of fall away, or it can cause them to turn other people away. And it's just they get hung up on this little thing, and they think that it changes. And that's why we have 20,000 denominations, because everybody talks about these other things. And that's why I'm sort of saying, here's the doctrines, and you can sort of think of what you want about them. You know, if, like you said, thinking of God as sort of like he experienced these emotions and that causes him to sort of change, or it's like he's having like a reaction to the sinfulness of man, so he causes a flood. You know, that it could be, you know, and I don't think there's anything wrong with thinking that. Hold it. You gotta hold it till the light turns on.
You're speaking about the omnipresence of God, and we as believers the Scripture says we are given the deposit of the Holy Spirit within us. So we have the presence of God even in our spirit by His Holy Spirit. So it's amazing.
I mean, yeah, I haven't sort of, the Trinity is a whole nother section. So when I'm talking about God, I'm referring to sort of the Godhead, just God as a whole. There are sort of, again, we believe in a God of three, a God in three persons. And that sounds very confusing, and that's why I'm going to do a whole section on it. So when I say God, I just mean God, the Godhead. And again, like that could also just be language. You know, it could just be like a way of expressing the way that God's presence sort of moves us. You know, that it's a way of expressing, oh, God's in us because it sort of causes us to do things. Like, is God literally in us? I don't know. Like, it could just be language. Anything else or anything that anybody wants to talk about? We got a couple minutes. I'll open it up. If you want them to be.
You mentioned earlier a barometer. What's a barometer?
All right, what's a barometer? He doesn't want his bad jokes. Everybody that's listening, he doesn't want his bad jokes to get recorded. All right, so again, we got two attributes. Next, we're going to probably go into God's omniscience, but I don't think that'll happen until after the holidays. So everybody has a month off. I thank